So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your session today. My name is Denise Turner. I'm the Director of Research and Insight at Newsworks in the UK. And I have the absolute privilege of talking you through some of the recent findings from research that we've carried out and what we're finding about actually how journalism matters to people, to society and brands. So I'm going to share my screen now. And then we'll just talk through the slides, and hopefully it will inspire you that journalism does really matter. So, as I said, journalism matters to the nation, to people and to brands. And I think that's a worldwide thing, actually. It's not just a UK thing. And it's become increasingly important as the time has gone on. So journalism matters to the nation. That's the first bit I'm going to talk about. A piece of research we did a couple of years ago, but I think really still holds true, is that World Without News, 70% of people think that a world without journalism would harm democracy. So if people can't find out about stuff, they don't know what's happening, then that's going to make a huge difference to their lives. And we've seen that so recently, haven't we, with all the stuff that's happening with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And 61% of people agree that news brands have a significant role in making campaigns better known and more popular. So it's not just about telling people about what's happening in far-flung corners of the world, but it's about actually helping people to galvanize others into action. So it's not just the Ukraine appeal, but also we've seen lots of evidence over the years of news brands really making a difference to people's lives, you know, whether it's trying to combat homelessness, whether it's trying to improve education standards, whether it's trying to expose things that are happening and holding industry bodies to account. That's so important that news brands do that. So journalism definitely matters to the nation because it exposes things that otherwise might not be exposed. But you know what, the nation is one thing, but actually journalism matters to people. And that's why people read news brands in the numbers that they do. Actually, I'm just going to go back a slide, because what we find is that actually people turn to news brands in times of crisis, but also in times of hope, when they want to know what is going on, what they want to find out. A piece of work we did last year with Flamingo and Tapestry was that actually news brand readership helps us to define and test our values. And if you do a model of people's attitudes to politics, to risk and success, it's almost twice as effective as using demographics only. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face when we look at news brand readership, is that people think, oh, it's just old people doing it. It's just young people don't do it. But actually, it's not about demographics. It's about our values and our attitudes. And that makes us read the news brands that we do. And it's really helpful. And it's not like people just lap it up either. People do challenge what they're reading, but it makes them form opinions and views on the world. And I think that's so important. And I talked about the numbers, and people read news brands in ever greater numbers. So the latest UK readership stats, 24 million adults every day read a news brand, 10 million of those in print. And there's a lot of crossover as well. So, you know, there's a significant number, and I often talk about comparing it to local TV programs as well. And the biggest TV program in the UK is probably something like I'm a Celebrity, which gets 11 or 12 million on an episode. So we have a significant amount of reach, 40 million adults every week and 46 million adults every month. So this is significant in terms of the amount of numbers of people that are being reached by news brands. So it definitely matters to people, because they wouldn't read it if it didn't matter. And also, you know, I talked about Russia, Ukraine earlier, and people turn to news brands in terms of crisis. And this is some analysis we've done using daily digital data for news brands. And given the point I made about the fact that news brands are both print and digital, this was just looking at a 4-week period from the early February to early March, and looking at the amount of time that people were spending with news brands over that period. And it's, I mean, it's significant anyway, in terms of the amount of time that people are spending. It's, you know, sort of almost 100 million every day. But look at when Russia invaded Ukraine, 25% uplift in the amount of minutes that people were spending on national news brands digitally. 116 million minutes that day were spent with national news brands. That is astonishing, because people are turning to news brands to help them understand the why behind the what. And I think that's what's important. And we find it in the pandemic. You know, in the UK, we had the daily news, TV news briefings, and we could see that people were, you know, watching what the Prime Minister was saying, but actually they turned to news brands in greater numbers because they needed to understand the why behind the what. You know, what can I do? What am I supposed to do? In the first lockdown, it was probably relatively straightforward. You weren't supposed to go out at all. But as things eased, it became increasingly difficult for people to work out what they could and couldn't do. And news brands really helped them to understand what was going on. So journalism absolutely matters to people, because they turn to news brands in times of crisis. And I think what's interesting is not just about Russia invading Ukraine. A couple of other things we've highlighted there. In the UK, we had quite a significant storm back in mid-February, actually. And people were wanting to work out, well, can I go out? What's going on? You know, is it safe to go out? So news brands were really helping to help people to work out what was going on. So there's definitely a sense of journalism matters to people. But I think importantly, and you know, we're not in this just for the sake of it. We're in this to make a difference to people, to the society, and to brands. And journalism definitely matters to brands. And that's one of the things at Newsworks in the UK we've been focusing on over the last few years, is proving that advertising in news brands makes a huge difference to those brands. And so I just want to take you through a few things that we've been working on. So we've done quite a lot of work with Peter Field and the IPA data bank. And that's a vast database of case studies of effectiveness going back to 1980. Now, what we've done is we've sort of cut it off or limited it to the last 10 years, because news brands, and I've talked a lot about this already, but news brands are both print and digital. And really, we've only been measuring the digital aspect of news brands, and it's only been really significant over the last 10 years. So we've just looked at the last 10 years. And this is looking at all of the case studies and the amount of cases that are reporting a very large trust effect. And what I quite like about this is it's not linear. It's sort of 11, 8, but look at what's happened over the last couple of years of the data. 30% of brands reporting a trust effect over the last, in 2016 to 2018, but a massive rise to 55% in 2018 to 2020. And that is quite significant. And actually, it was the first time that we found something like this. And when I chatted to Peter Field about it, he was absolutely astonished. So it's a trusted place for brands. And in a world where we have lots of misinformation and disinformation, having a trusted place where your brand can advertise is absolutely vital. And I think this data really sort of proves that that is so important. And using the same data, actually, from the IPA data bank study, one of the things that I often talk about is that, you've got so many different options in terms of, you've got so many different options in terms of which channels you should advertise in, what you should be doing. But why should you leave news brands out? And I've had conversations with clients and agencies that have said, well, I've got TV and I've got digital, and then there's not a lot left. But what I want to say to them is that campaigns using news brands are so vital to increasing your key business effects. One of the things we found from the IPA data bank study we did with Peter Field was that new campaigns that use news brands are 74% more likely to deliver market share growth. So that's, I mean, which client does not want market share growth? Absolutely vital. And this is a sort of slightly, the bottom one is 58% more likely to deliver profit. Well, which client doesn't want to deliver profit? Of course. I think the middle one is quite an interesting one, which is much more likely to deliver a reduction in price sensitivity. And that means that actually people are prepared to pay a bit more for your product. And that is, in terms of margins, etc., that is so important. And so if brands advertise in news brands, they're much more likely to deliver a reduction in price sensitivity. The reason that there's not a stat on that is because actually campaigns that didn't use news brands weren't more likely to deliver a reduction in price sensitivity, whereas I think it was somewhere around 11 or 12% for campaigns that use news brands. So you can't have, if you know maths, you can't do it something over naught, doesn't work. But I think that's sort of really helpful in terms of, news brands need to be part of the campaign. And I've said this ever since I've been at Newsworks, that if you are part of a campaign, you need to be at the right level, but don't not include news brands as part of your campaign. We've done a bit of work, really, and this is quite topical, I think. We did a bit of work with neuroscience, because I think always, if you ask people what they think about things, they're not always brilliant witnesses of their own behavior. So we did a bit of neuroscience work, which is sort of just really trying to understand people's memory or brain responses to advertising, because one of the challenges we've had over the last few years is this whole idea that hard news, or difficult news, or political news, or war news is not a place where advertisers want to be. And I think that whole sort of brand safety versus brand suitability challenge comes in. And one of the things we've found over the last few years, it's definitely not acceptable to be next to an ISIS video online, but it's perfectly fine to be next to an explanation of what ISIS is meaning, or what the challenges are around the terrorism that we're facing these days. And so what we were finding was that lots of advertisers were sort of questioning where they should be online. And it sort of it's counterintuitive to what used to happen, and I'm sure this is the same around the world. What used to happen was that advertisers would pay a premium to be in the front part of the newspaper, which is where all the hard news generally tends to be. And of course, publishers are going to be really sensitive to situations, so they wouldn't put an airline ad next to a story about an air crash, etc. But I feel like when it comes to digital, people have erred so massively on the side of caution that they're missing the opportunity of advertising next to places where people are absolutely wanting to read what's happening. And I think that's what we've seen. We saw with coronavirus that coronavirus was on lots of digital block lists, but yet people were wanting to know what was going on. So advertisers were missing out on vast amounts of audience just because they were erring so much on the side of caution. And I think we haven't seen quite the same effect in the UK on the Russia-Ukraine situation, but we're keeping a watching brief on it, because if that's where people are at and they're wanting to find stuff out, they're really engaged, surely an advertiser would want to be part of that. And one of the things that we found, we did a piece of neuroscience research, and we classified people looking at hard news versus what we call soft news, lifestyle, cookery, etc. And actually, people in soft news are still spending a significant amount of time looking at the ads, over 30 seconds. And when you look at this, the industry standard viewability, it's like 50% of an ad for 1 minute, 1 second or more. This is a significant amount of time that people are spending on advertising in news brands, and even more for hard news because they're so engaged with the content and they're spending time with the ads as well. So I think these sorts of, whilst we don't want these sorts of situations, advertisers should not shy away from advertising next to content that reports on these situations and talks about them, because people read news brands to know what's going on. So advertisers need to be part of that. And ad effectiveness is increasing. And so this is using some data from a company called RAM Metrics, and they measure ad recall, recognition, engagement, and action for a series of different brands. So there's thousands of case studies as part of this database. What you can see is that, ad effectiveness, ad recall is not diminishing. There was obviously a bit of a decline in 2020, but that's to be expected. Life changed for everybody in 2020. But news brands are not dying, and they are still proving really effective for brands. And what I love is that things like engagement and brand recognition are increasing over time. So if you can get that recall, actually people are so engaged with the content that they're seeing, so engaged with the brand advertising that they're seeing, and that is making such a difference. I'm going to talk a little bit more about effectiveness, because one of the big pieces of work we've done over the last couple of years is on effectiveness. And 3 years ago, we launched the biggest ever effectiveness project for news brands called Planning for Profit. We uncovered that actually not investing enough in news brands was having negative results for advertisers, and they were missing out on £3 billion worth of profit. And that, I think that sort of pricked people's ears up. They were like, what, why? What we did, was go back to that. And there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then, not least a global pandemic. So what we set out to discover as part of that project, this new project, was, did some of the £3 billion worth of profit, had it been found? What was the potential for future profit, and whether investing in news brands is still effective for advertisers? And then I've got a couple, I'll talk through a couple of examples of brands from the UK that are getting it right, because I think it's always helpful to have that context of what we're talking about. So our voyage of discovery, we had a decade of effectiveness data, and I think we live in such a short-term world that people think that anything happened before yesterday is not really relevant, but actually you need to build up that evidence base over time. So what we did was a meta-analysis of 1,012 econometric models. I quite like that. I don't think it's like over 1,012. It was 1,012. And we had bespoke learnings for 90% of advertised brands across multiple categories, and result for both print and digital news brands. So the key measure that we looked at was profit return on investment. So one of the things that I often say when I talk about effectiveness is that you can sort of buy sales. You can, if you do promotions or you do different sales tactics, you can buy sales, but you can't buy profit. So the key measure that we looked at is PROI, or profit return on investment, and it's a simple way of describing it is the sales revenue achieved multiplied by the profit margin. So if you have £10 sales revenue, you have a profit margin of 10%, then you get £1, but you have to divide it by the media investment, because you had to spend money to get that revenue and that profit. So what we found was that actually over the last 3 years, brands enjoyed a 10% profit boost by investing in news brands. So you think about that 3 billion, that reduced to 2.7 billion. So there were, well, just under 2.7 billion. So there was 268 million more profit, additional profit, because people were investing in news brands at the right level. And actually the future is really bright. And if you model that out over time, then brand investment, if you profit due to news brand investment is forecast to rise to 1 billion. Sorry, I get this wrong. But, that 3 billion has gone down to 2.7 billion. And then it's going to reduce to 2 billion by 2025 if advertisers continue to invest the same level in news brands and increase their investment in news brands. And also, it's not that we're saying that you need to invest 100% of your money in news brands. I mean, it'd be nice if they did, but it's not going to happen. And actually, you need multiple channels in a campaign. But if you don't invest in news brands, you're really missing out. And it also increasing investment in news brands from low levels delivers better gains than doing the same for all other channels. So you need to, I often talk about cake actually, and getting the right combination of ingredients. And if you don't have news brands as one of those ingredients, then you're going to be missing out. So as I talked about, over 2018, 2019, as investment in news brands did increase, advertisers did benefit from that 10% increase. And you can see, yes, 2020, we saw a bit of a decrease. So we start off in 2017 with the 3 billion missing profit. We sort of start to eat away at that. We had a little bit of a setback in 2020. But if we look at it and then we model it forward, actually there's a potential for a rising profit. If advertisers invest in news brands at, proper levels, then they can definitely gain more profit over time. So we could see that 3 billion that I talked about right at the start, reducing to 2 billion missing profit by 2025. And I don't really want to forecast beyond 2025. Who knows what the world is going to be like at that point. Brands that are getting it right. I've got a couple of examples actually, because I think it's always good to put things in context. And this is at Lloyds Bank, so UK bank, and they did an amazing partnership with the Telegraph in the UK, which was all around crossword clues. And if you're a crossword fiend like I am, you'll love this sort of thing. Or if you play Wordle, which the New York Times bought, it's tapping into people's passions and interests. And Lloyds Bank, I think, did this really well. And this was the winner, the Grand Prix winner of our planning awards, actually, back in sort of June 2021, last year. And just really tapping into people's interests and passions and showing that hard news is important, yes, but actually people do want the other stuff as well. And this was just really working on what journalism was really all about. And Lloyds Bank are a super great supporter of news brands, which is lovely. Tesco, UK supermarket brand. And they really sort of tapped into some of the things that people were feeling and thinking and doing over the pandemic. And I love the one on the left, really tugs at my heartstrings. So I just acquired a puppy. And, they were, so for some, staying at home isn't over. That sort of whole idea of going back to the office and what was going on. And they really tapped into people's emotions and thinking and feeling. I love the one on the right as well, where they were telling people not to buy their beer from Tesco, but to go to the pub because pubs were reopening. Such really tapping into the mood and emotion of the nation. And so those are brands, I think, they're definitely getting it right. So I think just in conclusion, hopefully I've shown you, that journalism matters to the nation. It's really important that we surface the issues that matter. Journalism matters to people and they're reading news brands in ever greater numbers. And finally, and most importantly, probably from an advertising perspective, is that journalism matters to brands and advertisers can so benefit from backing journalism and being part of the story that's told. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that's been really helpful. Thank you.